It's afterwards.
Repository of these that students can sign off if they don't mind people watching. Do you get my colors? Grass, soil, and ground.
Yes.
Do you see that?
I do.
It's a little cartoonish. But
I like it.
I was wondering if anyone would catch that.
I was sort of like, I normally start off with like Great Lakes pictures or something. I was like, this is about surface water.
I was gonna put some
got the
trees and
vertical
like a big well pumping out of the ground, but I was like, let's keep it simple.
Right.
Keep it simple. For those of us that have ever studied groundwater hydraulics, you know that's the symbol for a water table, right?
So much water.
Probably gonna get started right away. Just since I have. Okay, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're gonna get started right at 2. We have a lot packed in for the next hour and a half, so I don't want to fall behind. Again, thank you for coming. My name is Zachary Curtis. I'm an environmental engineering PhD candidate and also an ESPP student. And this is an opportunity for me to discuss my area of research, overview my dissertation research, but also to have a broader discussion on my area of interest, which is groundwater, more generally water resources. And so I've assembled a panel today of experts to help me have that broader discussion with you. Again, my name is Zachary Curtis. We have Dr. Steve Hamilton, Professor of Ecosystem Ecology and Biogeochemistry at the MSU Kellogg Biological Station. And this fall started serving as a senior scientist at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies in New York, correct?
Yeah, in addition.
Laura Young, sitting right up front here. She's an outreach and research specialist at the Institute of Water Research and also a graduate student in the Department of Community Sustainability. And Dr. Yadu Pokril, assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And so what we're going to do today is have 4 short presentations with, if time, we'll have quick question and answer session after each presentation. At the end, I built in some time for us to have a 2-way discussion. So if you have specific questions, try to ask those right after the presentation. But if you have more general questions, maybe save those for the end, or we can follow up on anything that we don't have time for as we move through. Today, we're going to focus on what is groundwater modeling, and I'll describe my Michigan groundwater research project that I've been working on for my PhD. We'll talk about the links between groundwater, water resources, and ecosystem health, both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. We'll talk a little bit about groundwater management and decision support. What are the tools that are available? How do we go about doing this? And then finally, we'll end with some global perspectives on groundwater use, groundwater depletion, and its role in the water cycle and water scarcity. So part 1 is my presentation. Okay, so I'm going to talk about groundwater modeling in general, and then I'll go through and do my best to summarize what I've been working on the last 4 years. So groundwater is a key part of the water cycle. Groundwater constitutes all of the water flowing through saturated porous media or fractured bedrock in the subsurface. And so water infiltrates, usually in the highlands, as recharge or infiltration, moves through the subsurface, and eventually discharges into lakes, streams, or possibly the ocean. And so groundwater links what's going on at the very surface in terms of precipitation, surface water infiltrating, to the eventual discharge of our ecosystems, rivers, streams, etc. And water itself can change in quality as it moves through the subsurface. It can also change in quantity, meaning flows, levels can change in response to climate variabilities or human activities especially. And so the mathematical framework that we approach groundwater science with basically boils down to 2 main ideas: conservation of mass and what's called Darcy's law. So the conservation of mass is essentially looking at a groundwater system, an aquifer, trying to figure out what are the inputs of water, what are the outputs, And basically, the imbalance of that gives you accumulation or loss of water. And so some of the inputs, we look at recharge, precipitation that makes its way down into the water table. We look at evapotranspiration, trees, and direct evaporation, removing water from the ground. We look at surface water exchange with rivers, lakes, etc. And we apply Darcy's law for movement of groundwater in between these sinks and sources of water. And Darcy's law simply states that the flow between one location and another in porous media is directly proportional to the difference in head, hydraulic head, which is essentially the water level that would, the level at which water would rise to if you stuck a piezometer into the porous media. And so if we combine these two basic ideas, we can use models, both analytical but mostly numerical models, to visualize the subsurface, analyze the subsurface, and evaluate the impacts of management, climate change, etc. And so here is just a cross-section of the subsurface and a hypothetical groundwater system. We have leaking from a contamination site, say a septic field, oil tank. We can visualize how that moves through the subsurface. We can see how the water table, the topmost boundary of the groundwater, changes in response to large-scale pumping. And we can see or predict the interactions with ecosystems. So again, this is just a cartoon, but this is an idea of what groundwater modeling allows us to do. And that's based on that mathematical framework that I introduced in the previous slide. So what I want to talk about for the next 15 minutes or so is a summary of my dissertation research as an application of what we can do with groundwater modeling. And so the topic of interest is groundwater sustainability in southern Michigan, lower peninsula of Michigan. And in particular, we're looking at the salinization of groundwater in our shallow aquifer systems, which are critical for groundwater-dependent ecosystems and water resource development. So we're looking at the shallow subsurface where we withdraw water from. But in fact, this problem is related to a deeper issue. And I'll come back to that in a few slides. But what I'm showing here are the locations of water wells yielding chloride concentrations above certain thresholds. And that's what is indicated here. Chloride is an ion that contributes to total dissolved solids in water, and it contributes basically to salinity. So we're using chloride throughout our study as a proxy for salinity. And so what I want to point out on this map is that we have clustering of elevated wells on the west side of the state near the coastline. It's called the Michigan lowlands. An obvious contamination hotspot in the Saginaw lowlands near the Saginaw Bay, and also along the east side of lower peninsula Michigan. And so the issue, again, widespread shallow salinization of groundwater. The broader implications are that concentrations well above natural levels, which are about 10 to 20 milligrams per liter, as we get above 70, 100 milligrams per liter, up to 200 milligrams per liter, a lot of the crops we grow in Michigan are susceptible to damage. So if we continue to apply that groundwater on crops that we grow in these areas, we may see either acute or chronic damage to crops. And so the first order threat to sustainability is dealing with food production. As you get into higher and higher concentrations above 500 milligrams per liter, a lot of people can taste that. 1,000 milligrams per liter, which is some of these data points, you can certainly taste the salinity in the water. So there's implications for drinking water aesthetic quality as well. So what were the key research questions? What controls the large-scale pattern that we observed on this previous slide? What controls the severity and extent at local scales? So when you zoom into a hotspot, why are some areas more impacted than others? What role does human activity play? For example, pumping of water or road salting, etc. And how can we actually manage this problem? It's so widespread, it's so dynamic. How can we do this? And so one thing to note is these questions relate to a large system with multiple scales involved. And we're looking at large-scale problems. We're trying to address local issues, local management. And so we have multiple scales involved. It makes this question, do we have enough data to actually understand the system, reproduce the system using groundwater models, and then manage moving forward? So the way we approach this is we use a two-pronged multi-scale modeling approach, meaning we're trying to model at different scales, both in space and time, and we're trying to take advantage of two basic approaches. One is data-driven modeling, and that's where we simply are using statistics, spatial interpolations, empirical regressions, etc., on currently existing data to do analysis. And so what I'm showing here is a map of wells in Michigan that belong to the WellLogic data set. And so we essentially have wells everywhere, about 600,000 entries covering the entire state of Michigan. And that includes important data for groundwater modeling. The type of lithology, I'll come back to this in a little bit. So what type of subsurface material are our wells penetrating through? There's information about water levels, so we can do spatial interpolation. And so the idea of data-driven modeling is let's identify patterns, trends, relationships, and connections. Then we zoom into areas of key interest and do more sophisticated process-based modeling. So that's where we're solving the fundamental equations of groundwater science or physics using computer simulations. We're calibrating those models, fine-tuning them to reproduce the trends that we observe with data-driven modeling. And in turn, that allows us to understand what's actually causing the patterns that we're observing across different scales. And so these are supplemental coupled approaches where you use existing data to identify patterns, more sophisticated analysis, and perhaps more site-specific data to develop process-based models, use those to advance our system understanding across scales. Okay? So the rest of my slides are just presenting results. If you're interested in the methods, please email me or talk to me afterwards. But I just want to go through some of our significant findings based on this approach. So what I'm showing here are basin scale patterns of groundwater levels. These are superficial groundwater levels, so water levels closest to the surface. And we map these using data-driven modeling. And what you're seeing in the color background is hydraulic head maps. And so red is where groundwater levels are high, blue is where groundwater levels are low. The overlay of pink dots are locations of wells where the chloride concentration that was yielded from a water quality test of that well is above some threshold. So on the leftmost map, we have wells above 250 milligrams per liter. In the center, above 500, and on the far right, 1,000. So elevated above natural conditions, well elevated, and extremely elevated. Okay. What we can see on each threshold, and especially at higher thresholds, is that the occurrence of these contaminated wells, polluted wells, is focused primarily within groundwater discharge areas. Okay, that's important because in groundwater discharge areas, groundwater is predominantly moving upward. It's coming from deeper below towards the surface. We did the same analysis at the regional scale, where we overlaid the occurrence of wells above certain thresholds and overlaid them onto the hydraulic head distribution. And again, for each threshold, we see far fewer elevated wells in the recharge areas than in the discharge areas, along the freshwater coasts, along the major stream corridors. We see this both in the Michigan lowlands, statewide hotspot, and the Saginaw lowlands, another statewide hotspot. There's been a lot of study in this area, including by Dave Long, a professor at Michigan State University, where they did geochemical modeling of the water quality here, and they inferred upwelling brines as the source there. And so our patterns are consistent with that interpretation. So if you're not aware, the Michigan Basin, the geologic structure underneath our feet, is a bowl-shaped accumulation of sedimentary rock. And deep, deep down in that basin, we have what are called brines. Those are hypersaline pools of groundwater. The brines of Michigan are greater than 100,000 milligrams per liter TDS. So these are 3 times as salty as seawater in some places. And on top of that sits our freshwater. And so if we look at these patterns, contamination in discharge areas, far less contamination in recharge areas, this is consistent with a deep source. And we know this because in recharge areas, groundwater is moving primarily down. Discharge areas, groundwater moving primarily upwards. And we know that there's brines deep down here. So this nested spatial structure suggests that we have brines deep below mixing with water that's moving towards the surface. So we then focused our efforts in the Michigan lowlands. This is an area, Ottawa County, Grand Rapids, Grand Haven area, beautiful part of the state, fastest growing part of the state as well. They've had significant increases in groundwater pumping. They depend on groundwater as their primary water resource in the region. And so during this population increase, especially in the last 15 years, but over the last 50 years, they've significantly increased their groundwater pumping. So this is a way for us to understand this is an area infected by or impacted by the brines. How does pumping for the groundwater use equate into this understanding? So we developed flow models for this area to understand how groundwater flow has changed in response to pumping over the last 50 years. we collected field data from wells across 500 locations in the Michigan lowlands, and we also mined historical data of chloride to figure out, has the salinity gotten worse with time? I want to summarize the key findings, and I'll show you the evidence for that. First key finding is that the 3D structure of the chloride. So before I was just showing 2D maps. What we did here is we mapped the 3D structure, and we found that that's consistent with a deep source. Namely, as you go deeper, the higher the concentrations you get. Other key findings: the local geologic conditions control the relative severity. So locally, when you zoom in, the type of geology you have underneath your feet largely determines how bad the chloride contamination gets at that scale. And finally, as we saw at the statewide and regional scale, the contamination is worse where the groundwater levels are low. And we found out this is both due to natural reasons and artificial reasons, human activity. I'll come back to that. So here's a map of where I sampled across the county. So here are field collected samples. The red dots indicate a higher chloride concentration, above 250 milligrams per liter, so well above natural conditions. We also mined historical data, and we visualized the concentrations in 3D space. And so here we're looking into the aquifer from Lake Michigan and also from above from the north. And so the brown surface is the bedrock top. The multicolored surface is the land surface. And so we have the superficial aquifer, the bedrock aquifer underneath, which is used for water resource development. Almost all of the high chloride concentrations were found down in the deep bedrock aquifer. We collected enough data, we were actually able to do 3D spatial interpolation and sort of visualize this chloride plume underneath the Michigan lowlands. So what I'm showing now is going deeper and deeper into that plume. And as you see, as we go deeper, the concentrations get higher, the contamination gets more pervasive. Okay, so this is consistent with a deep source, namely the upwelling brines that we discussed at the larger scale. We also developed a model of the subsurface geology. So here we're looking at aquifer variability. And so yellow colors are simply geologic materials which have aquifer properties. They transmit water well, they store, they transmit water well. And the other side, we have dark materials, the black and gray, which represent confining or partially confining materials, which do not transmit water well. And so this model is a 3D model of the entire Michigan lowland study area. Here I'm just showing cuts through the middle of it. And what I'd like you to pay attention to is in the middle, below a thin yellow layer, we have a thick dark layer. So in other words, below a thin aquifer layer throughout much of the study area, there's a thick confining layer between the top surface and the bedrock below. And you can see that as we look through different cuts. And so conceptually, this is important because that means there's slow flushing of this brine-influenced groundwater. And so where we saw clay or confining material in the glacial layer, directly below that, we see the highest chloride concentrations. That's also where the Marshall bedrock, which is the productive aquifer in the region, is subcropping below the land surface. So we have high concentrations, we have brines at depth, mixing with the near surface water, and we also have an impervious clay layer restricting the freshwater flushing from above. And so the local geologic configuration is important. The large-scale distribution of recharge-discharge areas is important on a larger scale in terms of natural movement of groundwater. Here, when we get too close to the subsurface, the local geology is important, of course. So coming back to the patterns between static water levels or groundwater levels and high concentrations of chloride, what I did was I extracted all of the deep CL samples that I collected from the field and from the historical data mining, and I overlaid that on the simulated bedrock groundwater levels. So we developed a flow model, we simulated and calibrated to the last 50 years of groundwater use, and we are showing the map of present-day groundwater elevations, and on top of that are the occurrence of elevated chloride concentrations in the deep bedrock. And so there's a pretty clear spatial correlation between the highest concentrations and where groundwater is low. And so what we found out through the groundwater flow simulation is that some of these areas have naturally been low for a very long time, at least back to the beginning of our modeling, the 1970s. Other areas have become low through groundwater use. And so here I'm showing snapshots of our simulating flow model at different years, 70, 1980, 1990, through 2015. And here's just a movie showing you. So you can see this expansion of the lowering of groundwater levels in the central part of the county. And so we developed a water use model across time, across the county. And if you look at the increase in water use across space and time, it largely corresponds to where we're seeing drawdown. And that's lowering of groundwater levels relative to the natural conditions. And these red colors here indicate drawdown of 15 meters or more. So we're talking 50 feet of drawdown in an aquifer right next to Lake Michigan. We were surprised to see that. But again, this is correlated to the direct water use that's built over space and time. So because we know the deeper you go, the higher the chlorides get, we know that we've been mining the deep aquifer. It makes sense that we would have upwelling of deep groundwater that would cause an increase in the CL concentrations. So we used the flow model. We did something called particle tracking, which allows you to visualize how flow moves in the aquifer. And this is a little difficult to see, but these flow lines in some areas underneath high capacity wells, that's the multicolored bars here, we see flow patterns converging upward, upconing towards these major high capacity wells. We also see it along the Grand River, which is a major discharge stream next to Lake Michigan. What I did next is I compared concentrations I collected in the field, and that's what's plotted on the y-axis, versus concentrations at the same well some point in the past. So I had a field sample, and I also had some sort of historical measurement from sometime in the past. This is all aggregated in terms of how far into the past. But what that allows us to do is compare the field concentration to the historical concentration at a number of different locations. So each dot represents a different location. Points above the 45-degree line are places where we've seen an increase in chloride concentrations with time. Points below the black line indicate a decrease with time. And so there's quite a bit of scatter below 200 milligrams per liter. We think that's related to natural fluctuations or fluctuations due to other sources of chloride, which might be road salt septic systems, which tend to cause lower concentrations, 200 milligrams per liter or less. But as we go to higher concentrations, we see a majority of these data points are falling above or well above the line of perfect agreement. So this indicates a general increase of CL concentrations with time. We had enough data in a few areas of the county, of the Michigan lowlands, where we were able to actually do 3D spatial interpolation for different decades. And so in central Ottawa County, where we had the expanding drawdown cone, where we saw the levels decreasing from natural conditions, we had enough data to look at the isosurfaces. So let's just focus on this middle row here. These are surfaces where the chloride concentration is at least 250 milligrams per liter. And then this column is up to 1995, data between 96 and 2005, and data between 2006 and 2015. And we had pretty good consistency in terms of data coverage across decades. And so we can see this plume expanding and getting larger with time in an area where we've reduced groundwater levels. The bottom row is just a different isotope. These are for higher concentrations, 400 milligrams per liter or more. Okay, so I know that was a lot of different maps. I just wanted to summarize, but coming back to our research questions so we can close the circle here. What controls large-scale patterns of groundwater salinity? The dominant source is the natural upwelling of deep brines into the groundwater discharge areas, low-lying areas where groundwater is moving predominantly upward. What controls the severity and extent at local scales? Is the problem getting worse? Through our investigation, our flow modeling, our field sampling, historical data mining, we found that the local geology, configuration of the geology is very important, and the discharge of the deep groundwater, again, is very important at large scales as well as local scales. We see a slow, subtle increase of the problem due to pumping. So ultimately, we want to know, Ottawa County especially wants to know, and the state of Michigan additionally wants to know, how can we manage this problem? And so I don't have time to discuss that, but next Thursday, I will be presenting on that particular aspect. And so if you're available at the ESPP symposium, I think I present in the morning sometime, Chris, I think it's 10:15. I'll be talking about how we use the information I presented today to actually simulate groundwater conditions for the next 20 years and evaluate for different locations of interest, what is this max sustainable yield? What is the available drawdown? What are the implications of water quality for those areas? So to summarize, we're trying to translate our science into policy by estimating the future conditions and max yields. So we'll take our calibrated flow model. We've worked with Ottawa County to develop detailed projections of the well build-out. So they've actually gone around township by township and tried to figure out, where are you going to need new wells? What's the projected population increase? Where are you going to expand your surface or your municipal surface water supply? That gave us detailed projections of well build-outs. They looked at their land use, land cover, tried to describe how that might change. We looked at likely recharge scenarios. And so we were able to look at long-term changes in groundwater levels. Basically, after 20 years more of development, where are the groundwater levels relative to today? With that information, I'm currently and have currently or recently performed well scale analysis. So going to a specific location, looking at the aquifer properties at that location and trying to figure out what's the max yield, how much can we pump before our water levels drop to either a level where the pump goes dry or where the water quality is unacceptable. And that all depends on what's the water quality or what's the water use. Okay, so I think I'm probably out of time for questions, but here's my email. I'll also be around afterwards to discuss anything related to my research. But again, next Thursday I'll be talking more about it. So with that, I want to give Dr. Hamilton an opportunity to describe his research. Thanks.
Beautiful turnout, and that was very interesting, Zach. I don't have any slides. I just thought we'd talk a little bit. I recognize half a dozen of you maybe know what you do, but most of you I don't recognize. And I'm kind of assuming you come from the physical science and engineering side of groundwater and hydrology. So I thought I'd focus on the groundwater dependent ecosystem part of the long list of things next to my name. but let me talk about my research just really briefly first. And by the way, I have to leave at about 10:45 to make another meeting, so it's not going to be dissatisfied with how this is going. So I work at Kellogg Biological Station in southwestern Michigan, and we do a lot of work on agricultural systems there. And I come to an interest in groundwater as an ecologist, trying to understand ecosystems and biogeochemistry. I've worked a lot on surface waters of all kinds down there. I think almost 20,000, made almost 20,000 samplings and measured the full chemistry and learned how to tell when groundwater is there or not. Thought about groundwater. Talk about in a second, but the other part of pertinent to this that we're very interested in water use by crops and the ecosystems. We're working a lot on the infiltration and percolation through the rooting zone. So the initial step in the recharge of groundwater, of course, is the water has to get through, into the soils and get through the rooting zone. And in Michigan, plants evapotranspire about 60% of the annual precipitation. So the plant use of water is key to that. And we're very interested in crops, perennial versus annual, and also comparing crops to forests and grasslands or abandoned agricultural lands, that kind of thing. So we have that whole line of research I wasn't going to talk about right now. Well, let's think about this groundwater dependent ecosystem. Humans are dependent on groundwater, and Zach talked about these brines getting into the groundwater due to pumping, and that compromises the quality of the groundwater for human use. So that's one aspect of concern about groundwater, right? It might kill your crops or might not be a good drinking water source. And that's certainly important. But we have an immense amount of groundwater beneath our feet in most places of Michigan. It's recharged every year, unlike some places where there's fossil groundwater that's used. And so when you pump it up and use it, you're mining a finite resource. Right? But that groundwater is recharged every year, but it also comes out in a more or less equal rate, minus human abstraction, right? And if it all came out in the deepest spot in Lake Michigan, few people would really care if the rate of groundwater coming back out diminished a little bit due to human use, right? But of course it doesn't. It comes out all over the landscape, right? And it comes out into wetlands, it comes out into lakes, it comes out into small streams and big streams. And those are what I'd call groundwater dependent ecosystems. And it's not just the biota, but human uses of those ecosystems that are adapted to that situation and can suffer change if we abstract a lot of groundwater enough to actually affect the rates. Okay, so why is groundwater important? Let's take wetlands and lakes to a certain extent, to any aquatic surface waters with plants in them. We can array them in Michigan on a continuum from 100% groundwater to 100% precipitation. And it completely changes the ecology of these systems depending on where they lie on that continuum. And I can look at the plants in a wetland and pretty much tell you that's primarily groundwater fed, that's primarily precipitation fed, that one's somewhere in between, because it so dictates the plant life there. Also, the chemistry is fundamentally different. So precipitation is this very ionically dilute, slightly acidic, nutrient-poor water. And if you have like an isolated bog that only is fed by precipitation, it's characteristically less productive in addition to having different kinds of plants than another wetland that actually gets groundwater inflow. Groundwater is, in Michigan, it comes to equilibrium with the minerals in the glacial deposits, and it's rich in ions naturally. And it's very hard from a water user perspective. Hardness is not necessarily a good thing because you got to have a water softener, right? Otherwise, it precipitates all over your faucet or bathtub or whatever. But when that hard water comes into lakes and wetlands and streams, it's of fundamental ecological importance. It buffers the pH, and it actually can sequester phosphorus and make the systems less productive. And often calcium carbonate, the same stuff that precipitates in your coffee pot or your faucet, precipitates naturally in Michigan ecosystems. And this has been happening since the glaciers retreated, such that we have many meters of what we call marl, calcium carbonate rich sediments that have filled in a lot of lake basins and wetland basins in Michigan. And they've formed a characteristic. If you've ever gone boating or fishing in Michigan lakes, that many of them have a shallow area and then a drop off, right? And that shallow area, that shelf, is typically calcium carbonate that's built up. Plants actually taking up carbon dioxide help precipitate it out. So that you've got a sediment that's completely calcareous and made of basically Alka-Seltzer, right? And that affects the characteristics of the ecosystem. Obviously, what can live there, plants that can root there. It also makes them very resistant to acid precipitation. So we never worried too much when our precipitation was acidic. And I say was because it's gotten much better in the last 20 years. But we had a volume-weighted mean pH of about 4.3 when I started working here. Now it's about 5.6, right? But that's very acidic water. But we never worried about it in southern Michigan because there's so much groundwater in our lakes and wetlands and streams that it effectively buffered against that acidification. What else? Groundwater tends to be a stable source. It doesn't change much from winter to summer. Its rate of discharge. And so groundwater coming into a stream or wetland or lake can stabilize water levels and flow. And in fact, many of our streams, especially smaller ones, would stop flowing in the summer if we didn't have groundwater. Right? So they run all summer long because they're running on groundwater. And that's not groundwater generally being recharged during the summer. It's coming out of this immense aquifer that's recharged primarily during the cool season, right? Another thing about groundwater is it's cold in the summer and warm in the winter because it takes on the mean temperature of the recharging waters. So in the lower peninsula of Michigan, it's usually 10 or 11 degrees C. So in the summer in southwestern Michigan, our only trout streams are the ones that have high rates of groundwater input to keep it cold, because otherwise they would warm up to the point where trout can't survive. So it makes a cold water stream, which supports a cold water fishery, which people value. Right? In the winter, groundwater fed ecosystems will resist freezing and actually are warmer than they otherwise would be. So it stabilizes the thermal environment. What else? You guys can help me, Jay. What else is important about groundwater? The contaminants in groundwater affect groundwater-dependent ecosystems. So our groundwater contains a lot of nitrate wherever there's any agriculture or a lot of lawns and septic. And nitrate, being very mobile, comes with the groundwater into the wetlands and lakes, and has surely affected the nutrient availability and the kinds of plant life in those systems. The stabilization of water levels extends to lakes that have groundwater inputs. Especially, many lakes they may not have an inflowing stream, but they support an outflowing stream, and that's because groundwater is coming in, right? And that stabilizes the water level of lakes. And then people like to buy lakeside real estate and build their homes and docks and all that, right? and they like that stability of water levels. Right? You could argue that, if we've got, say we've got 50 or even 100 feet of saturated thickness of an aquifer below a high dry place, why not draw it down 5 feet, 10 feet? Who cares, right? And no one's going to notice, right? Well, the people are going to notice. The first people that are going to be, coming to the town hall or whatever, are the people who live on the lakes. Because if you drop the water level of a groundwater-fed lake just 6 inches or 12 inches, you get a lot of upset people frequently. Right? There's been a lot of building in the last 30 years of homes gently sloping lake edges because we had a period of relative hydrologic stability. And then when we do get fluctuations, they get upset. So that's more of a social dimension to groundwater dependent ecosystems that people care about, in addition to trout fishing and just keeping things wet during the summer. Another is more from a conservation biology standpoint. We have a lot of groundwater fed wetlands, and in particular, one kind of wetland of conservation interest is called a fen. In Michigan, we call a fen a wetland that is groundwater fed, and it accumulates peat. It's that simple definition. But a lot of these are sloping wetlands, and the groundwater is coming out there. It's a point where the groundwater is discharging on its way to a lake or a stream. And then the peat builds up on the slope, and you end up having groundwater flow horizontally, or upwelling and moving horizontally all the time, all summer long in these fens. And they develop a characteristic plant life that is very much of interest for conservation biologists. There's also some rare butterflies and a couple other species of interest in the animal world that live in these fens. So that's a unique kind of wetland that's groundwater dependent. Needless to say, if you drop the water table, that area of intersection on the landscape's going to change, and you may not have a fen anymore. Groundwater might come out directly into the recipient water body. Anything else you guys can think of that I haven't thought of in this? Yeah, Jay.
And at the intersection of a lot of the points you brought up, but like legacy effects in groundwater dependent ecosystems may respond at very different timescales and might be fundamentally changed because of what happened in groundwater a long time in the past.
That's a good point. And we see that especially with contaminants, right? So you can age date groundwater with various techniques. One of the best is to look at the various CFC gases that were developed for industrial use at different times in the 1900s. And they contaminated the atmosphere, leaking, freon and the like. And then they get into precipitation, then they get into the recharging groundwater. Once they're in the saturated aquifer, they're conserved. And so then you can come to a groundwater spring, analyze these gases, and you can actually date the age when the groundwater recharged someplace else, hydrologically uphill, right? But when you do that for small streams and landscapes like this, it hasn't been done right around me in Southwest Michigan, but it's been done in Wisconsin and Maryland, various places. You'd be surprised how old the stream water is. Any guesses? You don't get to guess. How old do you think a small stream, not even as wide as this room, flowing in the summer in Michigan, how old is that water? When did it fall as precipitation? Any idea?
Guess.
Wait, what'd you say, Alex?
55
55 what?
years.
Ah, that's good. That it could be. Yeah, 30 to 40 years are common guesses. Well, you're going to tell us what your guess was going to be, Reba?
I was going to say 800 years.
800 years. I thought you guys would say like a week. Because in fact, if it rains, the stream goes up, right? But it's not necessarily the rain that's making the stream go up, right? What's happening is that the hydraulic pressure, if you will, of the new recharge is pushing out old water down in the stream bed, right? A lot of you, this audience isn't surprised by that. A lot of people are. Anything else? Any other reason we should care besides? Yeah.
Microbes in the groundwater.
Microbes. Yeah.
What if there's a microbial contamination that filtrated into the groundwater? Does it when the groundwater infiltrates to the soil water and surface water, does it bring the microbes into the surface?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting topic. We used to tend to say that microbes didn't move that much in groundwater, but then there was a realization that they can, especially in coarse media like sand. And there was a big MSU project that looked at this actually in geological earth and environmental sciences now. So there are situations where that can happen, and it's especially important when you have potential pathogens, like if you have animal waste being deposited on farmland. You know, if that can move to groundwater, it's especially of interest. There are natural microbes in groundwater that help to process contaminants and so on, right? So some of the nitrate and much of the nitrate entering groundwater flow paths can get consumed by denitrification, for example, if there's enough organic matter to support it. So the microbial processes are important with or without pathogens, right? Anything else?
The average layperson probably only knows about groundwater in Michigan because of Nestle.
Yeah.
Does it matter how old the water they're pumping is?
Generally, we've contaminated the aquifers from the top down, right? And the very bottom of aquifers in many parts of Michigan is very old water. It's been claimed it's even glacial meltwater still, right? You guys could speak to that better. So a large-scale water user that wants the best water is going to want to pump from deep if there's an area with, you know, nitrate or other contaminants near the surface. Pumping from deep can cause problems such as what Zach alluded to, and it can draw contaminants, can produce a cone of depression basically that can draw contaminants down to the deeper groundwater. All this bears on this legacy, I like to call it time lag because it won't last forever, but the time lag effect of any kind of contamination of groundwater, you know, the turnover time of these large groundwater reserves is extremely long, and once we contaminate them, it's a huge problem. It's a long, long wait, longer than any of us is going to live if we contaminate the groundwater now for it to naturally get, you know, purged out, right? So it's a big problem.
You know, with regards to the Nestle pumping, you know, I think the enforcement of groundwater withdrawals in Michigan is looking at impacts on surface water flows. And so as far as I know, the Nestle is a deep withdrawal. And so because it's so deep, the analysis that they did showed minimal or acceptable impact on the surface water, but that doesn't mean it's not changing the flow patterns deep, which will show up, you know, maybe decades later to wherever that groundwater was going in the first place.
You know, this is something we get again and again on the Water Use Advisory Council, for example, that you have these confined aquifers and unconfined aquifers in Michigan, and you have glacial deposits, and the confined aquifers are beneath some kind of a less permeable layer, say clay, right? But it's never a perfect cap. There's semi-confined is a better term probably, so there's some movement, and so you could put in an irrigation well below the less permeable layer and pump away and show that you didn't see any decrease in the upper level, and it all sounds good. But I always thought, you guys know this better than me, but it's going to be replaced by groundwater from the surface sooner or later. You can't endlessly pump, like produce a big vacuum under there, right? But there's plenty of exchange, and ultimately it will have impacts in the long term, maybe dispersed over a wide area, maybe someplace far afield from the pump, I don't know. But it's not factually correct, I don't think, to say it's okay because we're pumping beneath the confining layer. We're not going to have any depletion of the resource ever, right? But it's probably true that you're going to have less impact on the little stream on your property, right? So, yeah.
It expands it out to the true regional recharge.
Yeah.
It has a much bigger footprint.
And we don't map out those confining layers very well, so it's hard for us to struggle with that in Southwest Michigan with the water use question. Hard for us to define where a particular pumping point would cause those impacts, right?
We have time for one more question for Dr. Hamilton before he has to move on.
Okay, thanks for listening.
Thank you. Next, Laura Young is going to talk a little bit about her work. It should be open.
Should be open.
Yep. Absolutely. Red is the laser.
Red is laser.
Yep.
All right,
There's coffee and tea in the back too. I know they're kind of in separate locations, but if you're
Feel
looking
free to
for
get
the
up and help yourself.
caffeinated stuff.
That's right.
All right, well, hi everyone. I'm Laura Young. As Zach said, I work at the MSU Institute of Water Research, and I also went back to school. I'm now a graduate student in the Department of Community Sustainability. I would say for myself, I'm a bit more of a social scientist, and some of the work I'm sharing with you today are it's the work of my colleagues over at the Institute, and so I hope I can answer your questions, but I might have to direct you to them depending on what you ask me. So first off, I imagine a lot of you aren't really familiar with our institute. We are south of the tracks, like nowhere near main campus, which is actually really nice for parking. But we are part of a national network of different water resource and research centers across the country. Normally, the institutes are housed at land-grant University, so this is why we're at Michigan State. And our program was established by Congress in the 60s, and we're federally mandated to do water research, education, and outreach. And I would say each institute kind of has its own flair. We're all a little bit unique, different. And our institute in Michigan, we specialize in developing online decision support tools, GIS-based applications, and that kind of thing around water resources. As I said, I'm not a modeler or anything, but I do interact with a lot of the stakeholders that use our tools. And I'm usually the person going out and doing trainings and that kind of thing. So my introduction to groundwater at my job started with the Water Use Advisory Council that was just mentioned. So for those of you that aren't really familiar with Great Lakes policy, there's something called the Great Lakes Compact that all the Great Lakes states and the Canadian provinces signed, trying to keep water within the Great Lakes Basin here. So California is in big drought. They can't come in and take Michigan or the Great Lakes water, was the intent behind the Great Lakes Compact. And as part of that, each state had to come up with a way to track its water use. And so in Michigan, these various versions of a groundwater or water use council were established, and it started with this state of Michigan establishing them through the legislature, and the last iteration was convened by the Department of Environmental Quality. So researchers, government officials, stakeholders, well drillers, farmers, golf courses, all those kinds of different interests around the state got together and tried to think about what a water use program in Michigan would look like. And they came up with legislation that I want to say was passed maybe in 2008 or 9. And that program, or that legislation established the water use program in Michigan, and it's been running ever since. Part of that was the creation of the water withdrawal assessment tool. And depending on who you are, some people, I would say irrigators in particular, have maybe some qualms with the water withdrawal assessment tool. And recently, the legislation was actually updated to kind of address some of those issues that have come about. But anyhow, shortly after I got my job at IWR, I was asked to serve as administrative support for the council. So over a 2-year process, I had the sort of cool position of just getting to sit back, listen, and watch the council over its deliberations for those 2 years. And they ended up providing over 70 recommendations back to DEQ that they're currently in the process of implementing. So anyhow, my colleagues at IWR, they're really good at making interfaces. And so they developed the first iteration of the water withdrawal assessment tool, not necessarily the underlying models, but just the user interface that folks go through. And what this does is it helps facilitate the permitting process of these high capacity water withdrawals throughout the state. So instead of DEQ getting bombarded with thousands of applications, this is supposed to act as a screening tool to let some in that are predicted not to cause environmental degradation. And then for those that are, they get a special, what's called a site-specific review. A few years ago, they updated the interface, and this is now housed at the state of Michigan. All right, and shortly around the same time that I was doing Water Use Council stuff, the Ottawa County project that Zach talked about, the first phase of that launched. And I was sort of involved in that one, and then also had the chance to stick around for phase 2, where Zach and Dr. Lee's group continued to do their super awesome work. As part of that, my colleague Jason Powarski developed a online mapping interface where a lot of the data that Zach and Dr. Lee's lab produced as part of that project is housed online. And so you can go to that website, and what's really cool is that Ottawa County actually integrated this into their county website. So for residents living there or businesses that are concerned or just want to know what's going on, they can actually go in and view a bunch of this data. What's shown here are the chloride hotspots. This is both from the shallower drift aquifer and then the deeper bedrock aquifer combined, with red areas being potentially higher hotspots for chlorides. Also, as part of this project, we were responsible for putting together a groundwater guidebook and kind of trying to interpret the results that Dr. Lee's lab put together and provide some recommendations back to the county about how they might handle this situation going forward. And so I did a pretty long, extensive lit review, and what really, I guess this isn't surprising, but sort of surprised me, is that there's so little research done about water conservation messaging, and that kind of thing in areas with a lot of water, like in Michigan. Tons and tons of information in Australia, to some extent in California and Arizona. And so a lot of what we sent back to Ottawa County was based off of places that are experiencing some pretty significant water availability issues. And not that there isn't those issues here, it's just different and sort of a different context of life. I would argue a lot of people in Michigan aren't really thinking about groundwater or concerned that they're going to be buying for water availability. The last tools that I'm going to share with you today, they're sort of related, and they are field scale modeling tools that help simulate increases in groundwater replenishment by implementing agricultural best management practices. And so the first iteration is shown here. It's the Paw Paw River Watershed Recharge Calculator. And IWR has a pretty good working relationship with the Nature Conservancy. And the Nature Conservancy often will work with bigger agribusiness and other corporations that are interested in doing environmental sustainability projects and that kind of thing. So through TNC, they were working with the Coca-Cola Foundation, and Coca-Cola put in a new bottling plant in the Paw Paw River watershed, which is, here's my hand, it's like south or sort of southwest-ish, westish Michigan area. And Coca-Cola wanted to be able to offset its pumping, groundwater pumping in that area. So they were going to pay farmers to put in these different conservation practices, and they needed a way to quantify what that looked like. So we worked with a professor over in biosystems and ag engineering. He had an existing SWOT model that he used to simulate what those changes would be in terms of groundwater replenishment. And then we built an online interface to help simulate what those changes would be and walk the user through that process. This was a little bit more of a rudimentary version, and again, continuing our partnership with the Nature Conservancy and with funding from the CS Mott Foundation, we were able to take our lessons learned from this project and expand all that work across the entire Saginaw Basin in Michigan. And Nature Conservancy secured additional funding from Method Corporation, which is like the soaps and stuff that you might get at Meijer, Keurig Foundation, and Coca-Cola again, to support a water replenishment project across the entire Saginaw Basin. So again, they're paying farmers to put in these conservation practices and then offset stuff that those different folks are doing in the watershed. As part of this approach that TNC is using, what's interesting is in this case, they're actually doing pay for performance, which I don't know if you're familiar with that terminology, but a lot of agricultural practices are just paid on the acre, for instance. So if someone is implementing no-till or putting in a cover crop, you'll get some dollar payment per acre. And what the Nature Conservancy is trying to look into is, what if we paid farmers for the actual outcomes of those practices? So it might be paying farmers to reduce phosphorus. And in the case of groundwater, what if we pay farmers to try to increase water replenishment in that area? So in this case, our updated model here, it's incorporated in a platform we're calling the Great Lakes Watershed Management System. They can go in, digitize their field. They'll specify what the current management of the field is and then what the proposed one is. In this case, I modeled corn and soybean rotation and then implementing a cover crop on top of that. And then they'll get their nice little results saying, hey, you're going to increase water replenishment by X gallons. And I think this is about 1.3 million gallon increase. And then they can view their potential payments. And in this case, a farmer could get about $1,100 worth of funding for that increase in water replenishment. So again, kind of a different approach to conservation, but also interesting in that these different corporations are funding this work to offset what their own impacts are as companies. So for this particular one, there were individual SWOT models done for the entire Saginaw Basin, so like the Shiawassee, Flint, Cass, there are others. And they were all calibrated to multiple gauges in the watershed, so not just at the mouth, but also the ones that are upstream of where that data was available. Glenn O'Neill with our institute did pretty much the majority of this work, and so if you have specific technical questions, I can get you in touch with him. But I think it's just kind of a neat program, and I'll say, while this is a groundwater talk, this also includes nutrient runoff calculators in it as well. I have no idea how I'm doing on time. I feel like I'm kind of flying. But the one final thought that I kind of want to leave with today, and if we have time for questions, I can maybe touch on some of these pieces in a little bit more detail, is from the Water Use Advisory Council final report. And this quote, I think, kind of, I don't know, it sticks with me, and I thought it was highly applicable in the Ottawa County project. And anyhow, I'll read it. So, we must consciously attend to the political, policy, and public inertia created by the perception of water abundance. While localized conflicts over water availability may temper that perception, we should not and need not wait for such conflicts to drive change. We need to literally and figuratively look downstream. And so I guess we'll see, you know, as the conversations evolve today, but I think that just so captures challenges and getting people to think about water use in a state that, you know, is surrounded by 4 of the Great Lakes. And even in the case of Ottawa County, I mean, you're just a few miles from Lake Michigan, and trying to change that mindset about being more thoughtful about, you know, watering your lawn or whatever it might be. So for me, that's more my area of interest, and I'm happy to chat more as we continue the workshop today.
We have a few minutes for questions directly for Laura, if anyone has anything.
I have a question. That's something just, and I was thinking, and then this quote at the end here, I wonder if just like the current like political climate in terms of, you know, they're all trying to revitalize industry in Michigan and bring industries back. And industry is a huge use of, has really high water use rates.
Mm-hmm.
So is there, and it seems like there's policies in place that are having companies be cognizant of their water use, which is why they're willing to pay farmers, right, to not use as much water. But do you have any thoughts on how, you know, the public perception of like industry is really good about, you know, the water use of that, and if people are thinking about having policies in place to make sure that the water resources are managed effectively, but it's like big plug for bringing jobs back to Michigan, right? It's kind of tied with this.
I think
that was a question.
I think that's a good comment, and I would say it's tricky. I mean, from my perspective, I think for big corporations, they're going to want to be as water efficient as possible because it's going to probably save them money.
Yeah, right.
And at least, you know, Nestle was brought up. When you look at the state's water use, Nestle is less than 1% of the state's total consumptive water use. Ag irrigators are like 40 or 50%. So very, very different things. And we don't really think about farmers. You know, you might think like, oh, Nestle's taking all of our water. I know in Wisconsin, there's some controversy over, I think it's a Chinese company called Foxconn. They're putting in some big facility there, and I think it's for electronic processing or something, going to be a big water user. I don't know, maybe it's like a not in my backyard kind of thing too, like I don't want this big company here like using all of our water resources. As far as the state's policies go, commercial enterprises have to register their water use. I think this is a good question. You know, Nestle doesn't have to pay a whole lot to do that permitting process. They have a lot of money. We could maybe make them pay more, but that's not the way that the system is set up right now. I think what's really cool is that between Nestle, even the stuff with PFAS and everything, it's in the news. And I think it's getting people to even think about groundwater, which, you know, it's under your feet. It's not really in your mind. And hopefully maybe even having conversations with legislators about what they would like to see happen with this common resource. So I don't know that I answered your question, but
yeah, I just want to get your opinion more on that. So thank you. Yeah.
I'll just add on to that. In my experience working on the brine problem in Michigan is that we are really slow to realize that we need data on the subsurface. Over in Waterloo, you know, just across the Detroit River, they've been using groundwater and documenting the use of groundwater for over 50 years. And they figured out by budgeting their groundwater against their supply and their demand that for the next 20 years, they can take on slight increases or subtle increases in groundwater use without negatively impacting ecosystems, negatively impacting the pumps that they have installed in their municipal water supplies. But they're only able to evaluate that based on this wealth of data they've collected over 50 years. When I started looking at what are the pumping rates of all the wells in Ottawa County, high capacity wells in particular, the data only went back to 2012. And I was looking at 50 years of groundwater withdrawals. And so we had to come up with some innovative methods for tracking water use, which helped with my dissertation research, but it was a really big practical problem. How do we know how much we're using is okay if we have nothing to compare it to against natural conditions or past conditions? So that's going to be something I hope we realize. I think a lot of people on the Water Use Advisory Council, and hopefully we can convince legislators, we need resources, we need money to monitor the subsurface, monitor fluxes. Obviously all scientists need more data, but this is a must if we want to understand our groundwater sciences and resources.
Question on that, Zach. As the groundwater is pumped out in one region, would it develop some like flow capacity to move to another region, or what would be coming up beneath that?
So what happens is when you install a well.
Well, no, can you I have a follow-up to that, and I don't want to get too detailed on that. If there is movement from one area to another, when I was reading that policy statement, you could make decisions, say, okay, we're not going to pump here because we want the plants to do well, and that salinity level has to be less. But if they pump it out, could that actually shift, the water shift and become more contaminated underneath and move around? Would it be hard to, or is it basically stagnant as you pump the groundwater?
Whenever you start withdrawing, the system's going to adjust to compensate for that loss. You know, it's not. It gets to the point where the water levels will stabilize after a well has run for long enough, but that change, that is a result of some changing fluxes in the system. And so whenever we tap groundwater, we're changing the flow somehow. It's just trying to figure out what does that change relative to the rest of the system flows and water quality. But you need a lot of data just to model that, unfortunately, to evaluate the impacts. I think if you have a specific question for Laura, we'll have a little time at the very end, but we should move on so that Dr. Polfredo can talk a little bit about global perspectives. But let's thank Laura. Thank you, Laura.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to focus on about the environmental engineering. Jack, Steve, and Laura provided a very good overview of what's happening with groundwater here in Michigan. I want to take you guys all around the world and show you what's going on in different places. In terms of the water-related issues, Jack highlighted water quality, quantity, both here in Michigan. When I go outside of Michigan, people ask me, what issues do you guys have in Michigan? Because you have a lot of water, Great Lakes area, there's a lot of groundwater, a lot of precipitation happening every year. But still, we know there are issues, and Jack highlighted, I think it was 50 feet over the last few decades of time.
Most
right?
of that is over the last 15 years.
Right, yeah, people sometimes don't believe that. Of course, that's happening in the central US and the California area, but people don't think that this is happening in Michigan. And if you go outside of the US, India, China, Pakistan, and some other places, these issues are far worse than here in the US. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit. And also connecting this to the groundwater age that we discussed when Steve was talking about some of these issues here. There was a paper published in 2016 in Nature Geoscience. They took some isotopic data all around the world and then looked at the age of groundwater at different places and then estimated how much water we have globally. Because even this is something that we don't know, or we didn't know until that point. And you can imagine, this is published in Nature Geoscience. Probably it was an issue that's why this paper is published there. So they talk about two different ages. This is 50 and then 100 years or older. So there's a map in their paper if you're interested in going into the details. But here I'm showing how much water we have, first of all, globally. In the atmosphere, in the clouds, we have about 12,000 cubic kilometers of water globally. Vegetation, biological water, 1,000, and surface water, 100,000. Soil is this, but if you look at the modern groundwater, what they call the modern groundwater is with the age of 50 years or younger. And that is 347,000 cubic kilometers. And if you take into account even the older groundwater, we have 21.97 million cubic kilometers of groundwater. There's a lot of water in there in terms of the amount. And where that water exists all around the world, and we talked about there's water everywhere underneath our feet. That's why this is really useful resource. We can go and pump anywhere around the world, and you get some sort of groundwater. In some places it could be of good quality, in other places it could not. It could be of bad quality, but we have water. And why this is good is, even in deserts, if you dig a well, there's water in there. There's no surface water, but people could easily get water, right? That's why this is a really attractive source of water for people around the world. And in this study, by the way, they excluded the permafrost and areas in the northern high latitudes, whatever estimates are from the lower portion of these northern high latitudes. And what this map shows is if you take all that water out and spill on the surface, this would be the depth of water, like in a pond. This is simply the depth. So you see even higher depth in drier areas and so on. So anyway, there's a lot of water in there. This is something that we know at this point. And in terms of global water budget, I think Steve earlier mentioned 60% of rain that hits the surface is evaporated back into the atmosphere. Only 40% runs off on the surface or infiltrates into soil. Now the remaining 40%, 60%. The remaining 40% is going to flow to the ocean after all, right? Because 60% is evaporated, 40% is going to flow to the ocean. Of that 40%, 60% flows down to the oceans as groundwater. There's high uncertainty in there globally, but people have estimated that only 40% of the runoff going to the ocean is directly generated. It goes directly as surface flow. 60% goes as groundwater. It could be, groundwater that is recharged into deep aquifers and comes out after a couple of years and so on. Or it could be just intraflow, shallow groundwater emerging out quickly. And the shallow portion of the groundwater is a significant component of terrestrial evaporation. Plants uptake water from subsurface, and sometimes if the water table is shallow, there's capillary difference going upward from really tiny tubes in soil, and that contributes up to 15% of evapotranspiration globally. So it's very important resource for plants and other ecosystems as well. And in terms of human water use, I think Zach highlighted this in his synopsis that he put for this event on the web. 42%, I think 46 to 42% of the water withdrawals, domestic, industrial, or agricultural, is supplied by groundwater, and in some areas, up to 80% is directly supplied by groundwater, only 20% from surface water system. That's why this is so important. And over the past decade or so, my colleague Yossi Wada in Netherlands and I have been working on modeling the groundwater systems, trying to understand how much water is there, and then how much of that we are withdrawing annually, and how much is recharged back, and what is the depletion in different locations. And this is the map of global withdrawal that we have produced by combining our models and all kinds of data sets available globally. You see high withdrawals in India, Central US, Western US, India, Pakistan, and China plate, and so on. And the withdrawal rate has significantly increased over the past 100 years, of course. And what has happened with that is, in some areas we withdraw water, same amount is recharged because of precipitation, nothing happens. But in other areas like in northern India and Pakistan, unprecedented rate of groundwater depletion. This was, this is the results from a paper in 2009, and they use satellite data to understand that, because we don't have any measurement system in that part of the world. So they use NASA's satellite called GRACE that would allow them to see at what rate groundwater was depleted. And same thing is happening in Central US. This is my model results. If we were not pumping groundwater, this is just 8 years or so. If we were not pumping groundwater, water table would fluctuate, go up and down, and they eventually come back to the original position after 8 years or so. But now we start pumping, it persistently goes down. So we have huge issues of groundwater depletion there as well. Same thing is happening in Northeast China here. See this one. Rapid decline in groundwater levels there because of agricultural water withdrawals. And now a study that was published in 2012, the same guy, Yossi Wada, and other people, Tom Gleason, they took the data of how much water is withdrawn, how much is recharged, and came up with something called groundwater footprint and groundwater stress. And what they found is in some of these aquifers, this is the aquifer size, and this is, let's say in simple words, the rate at which we are exploiting the aquifer. So Anything that we, the amount of water that we are withdrawing, recharge is 22 times larger than the annual recharge. And there are, varying sizes of this groundwater footprint for different aquifers. The biggest one is almost 22 or something in India, and same thing is happening in central US and California and so on. So what this one tells is there are lots of groundwater usage all around the world, and we are exploiting groundwater resources in a really fundamentally unsustainable way. And now what happens when climate change keeps going, and we have variability in precipitation on one hand, and also there is ongoing sea level rise on the other hand. And one issue that we're looking at right now in a project that we have been working here at MSU, who is here, he's also part of the project here. We are looking at the Mekong River Basin, where, again, people think there should be no issues about groundwater. There's plenty of water in there, significant precipitation happening every year. But what's happening is in the upstream, people are building dams to, produce hydropower or divert water for irrigation and so on. And the other boundary right here, sea level is going up. And when groundwater recharge changes from the upstream, likely because of climate change, less recharge going to the downstream, water level going down, at the same time sea level going up, what's happening is a lot of saltwater intrusion happening in here. So this is something that we are trying to study, and we had somebody from New Zealand who had been studying this system for 10 years, and somebody asked, well, how much do we know about groundwater? He said that is the biggest issue right now. We don't have any idea what's going on with groundwater, how much water is there, where it comes from, and so on. So this is something that we're trying to understand in the context of climate change, sea level rise, and water use in the Mekong. And also, I talked about water use, human water use, and earlier Steve talked about ecosystem services and so on. How does this groundwater thing, which constitutes a significant portion of the global water cycle, interact with other branches of the water cycle? And I did the study back in 2012. This is in the Amazon River Basin. This is water table depth. You see really shallow water table over a huge portion of the Amazon River Basin. Less than 25 centimeters is the water table depth around here. Of course, in the Andes, right here, water table is deeper. So what happens when we have this shallow water right here? We found that this is the entire Amazon. What we looked at what we looked at in this study is what is the role of groundwater in modulating the entire hydrological cycle over the entire Amazon. And we looked at total terrestrial water storage change, and groundwater contributes to about 70% of variation in total terrestrial water storage. And surface water, river water, and snow, other components explain only about 30%. So groundwater hugely modulates the hydrology. So any change we make in groundwater, it's going to change the entire hydrology of the basin. And of course, some changes in hydrology of the Amazon, there are huge implications for global hydrology. And not only in the U.S. Of course, in the U.S., the climate system in the U.S. is significantly impacted by changes going on in the South, but it also has important implications for global hydrology. And with that, what we did is, so the groundwater is so important in the Amazon, and people are talking about the Amazon forest entirely, 50% of the Amazon forest entirely gone by 2050 or 2075, because precipitation is going to reduce. Red is reduction in precipitation because of climate change by the end of 41st century. This is temperature rise, 8 degrees Celsius throughout the Amazon, projected by some of the climate models. When this happens, drier and really, really warmer. What people said is this is going to trigger all kinds of things here. Forest fire would increase and vegetation would die in the beginning, and then that cycle would keep going. That goes into a positive feedback loop, and then 50% of the Amazon basin would disappear by 2075 or something. That was called really famous Amazon dieback. And what we thought, what we hypothesized here is probably these people are not looking at the role of groundwater, because we have 70% of the hydrology explained by groundwater, and these climate models have 2 meter deep or 1 meter deep soil. There's no groundwater at all. So what happens is there's a prolonged drought in the Amazon for a couple of years. Vegetation is not going to change at all, because there's a lot of groundwater in there. to 25 centimeter deep water. Water table drops a little bit, but roots are so deep that they can still tap a lot of groundwater. So there's no change. And what we found in this study is groundwater could really help here. And we put that groundwater into our model and found contrasting results compared to what they had already found. So this is how it is important in terms of climate, general hydrology, also not only about ecosystem services, human water use, and so on. And I think I'm moving toward the end of my presentation. This is a statement published from a paper published in Nature Geoscience by Ying Fan in 2017. What she said is we know very little about where groundwater comes from, what journey it takes, and how long it has been in transition on a global scale. So very limited understanding. There's some data, but not as much as what we have in Michigan. Zach talked about a lot of data sets here, but globally, forget about any kind of data we can get for different countries around the world. So there's a big challenge. We have some understanding, but very long journey to go in terms of understanding groundwater systems globally and providing relevant information for sustainable resource management. Thank you.
Follow up with any specific questions for Dr. Pukrit?
I think I took up all the time, but
No, we have 15 minutes left, so plenty of time. I have one question, and I think you know the answer, but so we pump a lot of groundwater globally, obviously, and that goes onto the landscape. Some of it evaporates, but some of it eventually makes it to the sea, the ocean.
Yeah, that's an.
So what's the impact of that? Have you quantified that?
Yeah, I didn't talk about that. I published a paper in 2012. There's a lot of discussion going on still, and also it's still something that is not clearly known. If it is really deep groundwater, fossil groundwater that is pumped, then it's going to take probably hundreds of years at least for that water to get back to the aquifer. And then and what we did is we did some simple modeling, taking deep groundwater, putting on the surface, and most of that in dry areas, because groundwater is pumped particularly for irrigation, huge amount. You put that on top of soil, that's going to get evaporated quickly because plants need water. That's why we put irrigation, right? And when that is evaporated, we don't know where it goes. Part of that may be recycled within the region and comes back and recharges groundwater. But climate models, the climate model part was not my study, but climate model simulations show that significant portion of that in many of the heavily irrigated areas, the water moves away. Then eventually that has to go to eventually end up in the seas, right? So what we found is 80% of that would end up in the oceans. And that is causing sea level rise. And my paper was published in Nature Geoscience in 2012. So I forgot 1-point-something millimeter per year of sea level rise happening because we pump deep groundwater that moves to different places, moves to a different place, and then eventually ends up in oceans, causing 1.8 millimeter per year of sea level rise.
Potentially a lot over 100 years, right?
Yes, a lot over 100 years. Wow. And that was, significant significant compared to other components like glacier melt, thermal expansion, and so on. Yes, Jay.
Nobody's brought it up today, but I guess you kind of, no, actually haven't. Groundwater discharge to coastal regions is extremely poorly quantified, and also a major human resource, right? Our coastal environments feed a lot of people around the world. It's where most people live.
Right.
And so we also, our heaviest footprints on the coast, we've contaminated that water, which now gets discharged into our coastal environments. So that's another kind of emerging global concept is groundwater, sea groundwater discharge.
Yes, and that is another fact that I didn't put here, but people estimate 5 to 10% of that entire, discharge going into the ocean is directly discharged into the sea from coastal areas, 5 to 10%, but there's huge uncertainty. And I think this is an ongoing research in there, but the only thing we could do is we could use models and try to estimate that and try to understand the interactions, but that's definitely definitely an important area.
I know there was a modeling study in the early 2000s looking at, of the groundwater that discharges in Michigan, how much of it is directly discharging into the Great Lakes. And I think it was about 30%.
30%.
Which is probably larger than global.
Yeah, globally they say 5 to 10%. Yeah.
But. Is there any questions from previous presentations other than obviously Dr. Hamilton's. And you can follow up with an email if you're very curious. Sure.
Is it maybe more of a naive comment or whatever, but for the human dimension of social science side of this is, why the heck would any political entity or those who fund them want to get long-term data?
That's a great point.
If all we can do is look forward and not worry about implications of what we've done in the past, that's a very much more of a business-friendly model. So I'm just wondering, you know, what's the difference between what you said University of Waterloo is doing versus what we could do here in Michigan? I mean, for me, the first thing I would say was they're vastly different political climates. So I don't know how you're ever going to win your argument of
Installing long-term monitoring.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for it.
Right. As a scientist,
I
right?
look at 3 long-term, you know, ecological research sites and things, and I'm all for that. But beyond our little research bubbles, we don't. There's no political or. I'm just wondering how we're convincing corporations and politicians to think longer than their business cycles, which are infinitesimally short compared to hydrological cycles.
Yeah. I'm not sure I have an answer. Does anyone else want to?
No, that's what I was saying. It's more of a comment
Right.
in the room.
I almost wonder there's something called the Michigan Water Strategy that was put on by the Office of the Great Lakes, which is now in the Department of Natural Resources. And that was like a 50-year plan, I want to say, for the state. I don't know if they had a specific thing for groundwater monitoring, but I think part of that plan was doing just investing in monitoring resources in the state, because usually that's one of the first things to get cut. And I feel like there are some businesses that are dependent on their groundwater resource. And so again, I think from that business, they have to take that into consideration in their business model. Because if they use all the water, they're not gonna be able to do what they need to do. So like in the case of Southwest Michigan, I think Abbott, I don't know if it's a corporation or what the official Inc., I'm not sure, but I think they do a lot of like pharmaceutical stuff. I think they make baby formula, that kind of thing. Pretty big water user there. And again, I think they picked that location based off of the groundwater resources available. So I think it probably depends, but I hear your.
Yeah, I can imagine like a farmer or smaller independent businesses are place-based and dependent upon that place's resources.
Mm-hmm.
But Nestle doesn't really care because they could probably
Go somewhere.
salvage almost all of their
that's
infrastructure they've invested here in Michigan and just go to the next place that has water resource. Right? So I'm just wondering, so these are tough questions.
Mm-hmm.
Please.
That hasn't come up yet. I mean, we've touched on the Nestle thing, and I'm not as familiar with some of the other industries and what their water use is for, but it seems like there's something kind of fundamentally different about explicitly bottling water to transport elsewhere. And that seems very different from using water in a production process to cool things or whatever else, where it's going to get used, but it's not really moving, and it's going to, hopefully there would be ways to redisperse that, and it would eventually, continue back into the cycle. So that just, I don't have a question in there, but just sort of a comment of, that seems like it's an important aspect of water use. I'm sure baby formula and various other things, it is a way of exporting water, but not quite as in your face as just a bottle of water. I don't know if that's why the Nestle thing has drawn maybe more attention than some of the other water users, because it's a very you're going to take it is our main purpose.
I wonder.
Some differences in just what those withdrawals are for and how they're used.
I don't think it changes people's perception if it's okay or not. I know when I know about it, most people know. I point out that, farmers, they apply a lot of groundwater irrigation. That food is leaving Michigan, feeding people elsewhere. And in the United States, we grow a lot of food using groundwater used elsewhere. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but that does change people's perception on whether it's okay or not. I think people, when they know the water's being used locally, they feel like they have more of a stake in it. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, I mean, I know like lettuce in Arizona is one example I've heard of where lettuce is 90 whatever % water, and they grow it in the desert to ship across the country.
Right.
And maybe even more than some of the row crops that we have in Michigan, where yeah, it is exporting water, but a lot of it is going to get respired by the plants and things like that, and sort of stay around.
Sure.
Different percentage, but it doesn't look as obvious.
Yeah, so I mean, there is a distinction. There's local use and local recycling, and usually, I mean, the way I tend to very simplify it is, if you're making baby formula, odds are that water is going back into the ground much warmer than it was before, or it has a contaminant with it, but it is staying local. Versus the extractive stuff where you're literally putting it in a bottle and taking it away, or you're putting it into the atmosphere and shipping it hundreds of kilometers away. So there are different impacts. So like Nestle's bottled water is not really probably contaminating the water anywhere around the extraction, but they are moving a lot of water out. So there's different uses, and they have their own different towns.
Yeah.
So some industrial processes that maybe all of it really stays in that place, but it comes out contaminated in some way. Trade-offs.
We have time for one more comment or question from the group. Please.
I heard in a popular media piece that anthropologists, and I don't know where this, I haven't found the base research, is that anthropologists, especially deep time human anthropologists, thinking that one of the preeminent signals of humanity going forward hundreds of years, and even I think their projection was more than 30,000 years, was that contaminated groundwater would be one of the most prevalent signatures of humanity left on the planet, thinking tens of thousands of years ahead because of the long time scales. And yeah, so anyways, if anybody knows that research, whoever, please look for it. Let me know. My name is Jason Anesky. I really want to be able to have that resource. It was like on the radio, so I thought it was really neat to think that actually groundwater, because everything we're talking about today, might be one of the best preserved artifacts of humanity. Should we go away?
I think with that, I just want to say thank you guys for coming. That's a great closing point. I think that's a really interesting, cool way to think about groundwater. But I hope you found this worthwhile. I hope you learned a lot about groundwater. I certainly did. I consider myself a near expert, but as you can see, there's lots of different scales involved. There's human dimensions. There's a lot of science left to be understood, but it's an interesting topic I fall in love with, and I appreciate you guys giving us a chance to discuss it in this forum. So with that, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I can get you in touch with any of my panel members or answer questions directly, but thanks again.
I think Judith had one. Judith, did you have a statement that you wanted to make or a contribution?
No, yes, I was listening in from the library, and I also think it's all about the winners and the losers. Using the political ecology framework, who are the winners, who is gaining more, and how much power do they have to kind of influence like water usage in that? I think I'll just catch up with you about that, Zach. Thank you for that presentation.
Thanks, Judy. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks everybody.